The railway changed the world. That's not a controversial statement. By the mid-1800s, steam locomotion had compressed distance, connected economies, and reshaped how human civilization moved across land. The history is well documented, the timeline is agreed upon, and the engineers who built these systems are named, celebrated, and catalogued. So here is a number. St. Pancras Station in London, completed 1868, was built with a single-span iron roof covering 240 feet. At the time of its construction, it was the largest enclosed space on Earth. Not the largest train station. The largest enclosed space on Earth. The question isn't whether that's impressive. The question is, why did a railway terminal, built for passengers catching trains, require the largest architectural enclosure humanity had ever constructed? And St. Pancras is not alone. Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, Leipzig Central, Washington Union Station, Milano Central. Each of these structures, built between roughly 1850 and 1930, contains interior volumes, structural complexity, and decorative investment that exceed, by significant margins, what passenger rail traffic at the time of construction would have demanded. Not slightly, not marginally. The gap between what was built and what was needed at the moment it was built is large enough to invite a second look. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but the questions are real, and they start with scale. When historians explain the grand railway stations of the 19th century, the explanation is usually confident and reasonable. Industrial ambition, national pride, the Victorian era's love of civic monumentalism, wealthy railway companies competing for prestige. These explanations exist, they are sourced, and they appear in every architectural history textbook worth consulting. And for smaller stations, the functional ones, the regional ones, these explanations hold reasonably well. The problem is the flagship stations. Take Leipzig Central Station, completed in 1915. It is, to this day, the largest railway station in Europe by floor area. It contains 83,640 square meters of usable space. In 1915, Leipzig was a significant German city, important, commercially active, culturally respected. But Leipzig was not Berlin. It was not a continental hub that would have justified, on pure logistical grounds, the construction of the largest railway terminal on the continent. The station was built during wartime. Materials were constrained. Labor was under pressure. And yet, what emerged was not a functional wartime infrastructure project. What emerged was a structure with two parallel terminal buildings joined under a single monumental facade, containing 26 platforms, an underground commercial arcade, and a roof system of such engineering refinement that it required no significant structural intervention for the next 80 years. The standard explanation, civic pride, regional competition between Prussian and Saxon railway companies, is real. It is documented. But when you stand inside Leipzig Central and look at what was built, and then look at the rail traffic records from 1915 through 1940, something doesn't fully resolve. The building was not built for the traffic it had. It was built for traffic that didn't arrive for decades. This pattern, infrastructure preceding demand, appears frequently enough in 19th century railway construction that researchers in architectural history have given it a name: anticipatory building. The idea is that forward-thinking developers and governments built beyond current need to accommodate projected future growth. That explanation is rational. It has genuine examples in urban planning, port development, and water infrastructure across the same era. But anticipatory building, as a concept, typically involves a factor of 1.5 to 2. You build for double what you need, expecting growth. Several of these stations were built at a factor of 4, 5, or more, relative to the traffic they received in their first decade of operation. Washington Union Station, opened in 1907, was designed to handle 50,000 passengers per day at a time when Washington, D.C.'s population was approximately 300,000. That would mean 1 in 6 residents of the entire city passing through the station every single day. The projection that would justify that capacity was not a modest overestimate. It was either extraordinary foresight or it reflects a different kind of planning logic, one whose documentation has not survived as clearly as the buildings themselves. And then there is the question of what these buildings contain. Railway stations, functionally, need platforms, waiting areas, ticketing facilities, and circulation. What they do not inherently need, what is not required by the task of moving passengers from one train to another, are grand vaulted ceilings rising 30 to 40 meters, carved stone facades running hundreds of meters in length, interior halls decorated with materials imported from 3 continents, or underground infrastructure connecting to systems that, in several documented cases, were never fully activated. Milano Centrale, completed in 1931, contains an upper arrivals hall, above the standard passenger concourse, whose original intended function is not consistently explained in architectural literature. The hall exists. It is monumental in scale. Its decorative program is complete. And the most commonly cited explanation for its presence is that Mussolini wanted the station to project imperial power. That explanation may be correct. But the hall was designed before Mussolini's involvement in the project. Its structural planning began in 1906. The political explanation arrived later than the architecture it is used to explain. These are not accusations of anything. They are chronological observations. The building came first. The explanation, in some cases, arrived afterward. Scale, timing, capacity beyond immediate need. Taken individually, each of these observations fits within the normal range of architectural ambition, political ego, and industrial enthusiasm. Historians have studied these buildings carefully, and the literature is extensive. But there is a different kind of question that architectural history by its nature tends not to ask, not because the question is dangerous, but because it sits at the edge of the discipline's methodology. The question is not, who built these stations? The question is, what were they built for precisely in the moment they were built? Because the traffic records, the population data, and the economic activity of the cities that receive these structures do not always produce a clean answer. The gap between documented need and constructed capacity, in several flagship stations across multiple countries, is wide enough that some researchers have begun to examine whether the logic driving these decisions was operating on a different set of assumptions than the ones that appear in the official project correspondence. What assumptions? Based on what information? Reflecting what model of the future? The records raise questions that the records, alone, do not fully answer. And that is where this examination begins. If Leipzig and Milano were isolated cases, the conversation would end there. Architectural excess in the service of political ambition is well documented across history. Pharaohs built temples larger than ceremony required. Emperors constructed forums beyond administrative need. The impulse to build beyond function is not new, and it is not mysterious. What changes the texture of this inquiry is repetition. Not repetition within a single country or a single political era or a single school of architectural thought. Repetition across geography, across political systems, across languages, and across decades, following a pattern consistent enough that, when you map it, the consistency itself becomes the question. The United Kingdom offers one of the clearest examples, precisely because British railway history is among the most thoroughly documented in the world. The records are extensive. The engineering correspondence has survived. The financial accounts of the major railway companies, the Great Western, the Midland, the London and North Western, are archived and accessible. And yet, within those archives, researchers who examine construction timelines against actual passenger growth data have noted a persistent structural overshoot that the financial logic of the companies themselves does not cleanly explain. Consider the Great Western Railway's Temple Mead Station in Bristol. The original structure, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel and completed in 1840, was built with a hammerbeam roof spanning a width that, at the time, had no precedent in civilian construction. The station served a line that, in 1840, ran between Bristol and London, a significant route but a single route. The roof Brunel built was not a practical response to the traffic of 1840. It was a structural commitment that implied a volume of activity that would not arrive for years. Brunel's defenders, and they are numerous and largely correct, argue that he was simply visionary, that he understood rail travel would expand rapidly, that his overbuilding was informed foresight, not anomaly. But Brunel's choices at Temple Meads are mirrored, not influenced, mirrored, by engineers in countries that had no direct professional connection to Brunel, working in languages he didn't speak, for railway companies that had no correspondence with the Great Western Railway. That is not how influence works. That is something else. In the United States, the pattern arrives slightly later but follows the same structural logic. Washington Union Station, already mentioned, is the most visible example, but it is not the most instructive one. The most instructive American example may be Cincinnati's Union Terminal, completed in 1933. Cincinnati in 1933 was a city in economic contraction. The Great Depression had reduced rail travel significantly. Passenger numbers were falling across every major American railway company, and the financial pressure on the industry was severe enough that several lines were approaching insolvency. And yet, Cincinnati built a terminal whose rotunda, at 180 feet in diameter, remained the largest half-dome in the Western Hemisphere for decades after completion. The station's mosaic murals, commissioned at considerable expense, cover thousands of square feet. The mechanical systems installed, ventilation, plumbing, electrical infrastructure, were engineered for a daily passenger capacity that Cincinnati's rail traffic would not approach even in the station's most active years. The standard explanation is that the project was a Depression-era employment program. Public works investment. The scale was, on this account, deliberate economic stimulus, an intentional decision to build large in order to create labor demand. That explanation is partially supported by the historical record. It is also incomplete, because the design for Cincinnati Union Terminal was finalized in 1929, before the Depression had fully registered in infrastructure planning cycles. The scale was locked in before the economic justification that is most commonly used to explain it. Again, the architecture preceded the explanation. This chronological inversion, where the building arrives before the rationale that would most logically justify it, appears with enough frequency across American rail infrastructure to suggest it is not coincidental. Kansas City Union Station, completed in 1914, was designed for 60 platforms. It used fewer than half of them consistently during its peak operational years. Los Angeles Union Station, opened in 1939, was built on a footprint that architectural historians have described as aspirational to the point of implausibility, given Los Angeles's rail usage patterns at the time. The aspiration in each of these cases was eventually partially justified by later traffic growth. Cities grew. Rail travel expanded and contracted in waves. Some of the excess capacity found use. But capacity that finds justification 20 or 30 years after construction is not the same as capacity that was built in rational anticipation of documented projected growth. The distinction matters because it changes the nature of the decision being made at the moment of construction. Someone, in each of these cases, was building for a future they expected with enough confidence to commit enormous financial and material resources to it. A future whose arrival, in several cases, was incomplete, delayed, or different in character from what the infrastructure implied. In the United Kingdom, the scale pressure appears in a different register, not in the size of individual terminals, but in the density and quality of the railway infrastructure laid across the country during the 1840s and 1850s, a period historians call railway mania. Between 1844 and 1847, the British Parliament approved over 9,000 miles of new railway construction. At the peak of this period, approximately 6.5% of Britain's entire GDP was being invested in railway infrastructure annually. To place that in comparative context, the United States at the height of the interstate highway system's construction in the late 1950s was investing approximately 1.7% of GDP in road infrastructure. British railway mania invested at nearly 4 times that rate in a shorter window with less advanced construction machinery, in a country a fraction of the geographic size. The explanations are available: speculative investment fever, parliamentary corruption, genuine industrial enthusiasm. All documented, all real. But the physical result of railway mania was a network whose structural quality, the bridges, the tunnels, the cuttings, the viaducts, was engineered to tolerances that far exceeded what Victorian-era traffic required. Many of those structures are still operational today, carrying loads and speeds their designers had no technical reason, in the 1840s, to anticipate. This is where the pattern begins to exert its own kind of pressure. Because what starts as architectural ambition in Germany, logistical overreach in America, and speculative fever in Britain eventually resolves into the same physical outcome. Infrastructure that outlasted its era, exceeded its immediate demand, and demonstrated an engineered durability that feels, in retrospect, less like optimism and more like preparation. Preparation for what, exactly? Some researchers, examining this pattern of consistency across regions and decades, have begun to situate these observations within a broader interpretive framework, one that groups them not as separate national phenomena, but as expressions of something operating at a larger scale. That framework has a name, and it is worth examining carefully, not as a conclusion but as a lens. The word Tartaria appears in historical cartography with less controversy than its current usage might suggest. On maps produced between the 16th and 18th centuries by European cartographers, including those published by reputable houses in Amsterdam, London, and Paris, the term Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, was used to designate a vast geographic region spanning Central Asia, Siberia, and portions of what is now northern China and Mongolia. It was not a fringe label. It appeared in respected atlases, in diplomatic correspondence, and in the travel literature of Jesuit missionaries and merchant explorers. Encyclopaedia Britannica's 1771 edition contains a substantial entry on Tartaria, describing it as a recognized geographic and ethnographic designation. This is the historical baseline. It is uncontested. What is more recent, and more contested, is the way the term has migrated from historical cartography into a different kind of conversation. One that uses Tartaria not as a geographic label but as an interpretive framework for precisely the kind of architectural and infrastructural anomalies this documentary has been examining. It is worth being precise about what that framework claims and what it does not. Within the community of researchers, independent historians, and architectural observers who engage with what is broadly called the Tartaria hypothesis, there is significant internal variation. It is not a unified theory. It is not a single claim. It is, more accurately, a collection of interpretive orientations that share a common starting point: the observation that certain features of 19th-century built environment, particularly in Europe, North America, and Russia, display characteristics that sit uncomfortably within the standard historical timeline. Some researchers within this space propose that the railway stations, civic buildings, and infrastructure systems examined in this documentary are remnants of a construction tradition that predates the historical period to which they are officially assigned. On this interpretation, what we call Victorian architecture is, at least partially, a reoccupation or relabeling of structures whose actual origins are older, and whose builders are not the figures named in the official record. Others take a more moderate position, that the anomalies are real, that the scale mismatches and chronological inversions are genuine observations worth examining, but that the explanation does not require a prior civilization. Instead, this interpretation suggests a degree of historical discontinuity, periods of institutional collapse, population disruption, or knowledge loss, that would explain why certain infrastructure appears to have been built with capabilities that the officially documented workforce would have struggled to deploy. A third interpretive position, perhaps the most cautious, treats Tartaria purely as a naming convention for a set of unresolved questions. On this reading, the label is not a historical claim at all. It is a placeholder for patterns that existing historiography has not fully integrated, and a signal that those patterns may warrant closer examination within mainstream architectural and historical scholarship. These are different claims. They carry different evidential burdens, and they should not be collapsed into one another. What they share, across all three interpretive positions, is a starting point that this documentary has attempted to trace honestly. The railway stations and infrastructure systems of the 19th century contain, in a number of documented cases, a relationship between construction scale, engineering quality, and contemporaneous demand that is difficult to explain through ambition and projection alone. The buildings are real. The scale is real. The chronological inversions, where design preceded the political or economic justification most commonly used to explain it, are observable in the archival record. Whether those observations require a new historical framework, a revision of existing frameworks, or simply more careful attention within existing scholarship is a question this documentary is not positioned to answer. That is not evasion. It is the correct epistemic position for a question of this kind. What is worth noting, however, is what mainstream architectural history has and has not done with these observations. The scale of 19th century civic and railway architecture is well documented. It is celebrated, in fact, in museum exhibitions and heritage designations, in the tourist literature of every city that contains one of these structures. The buildings are not ignored. They are prominently displayed. What receives less attention in that celebratory context is the specific question of proportionality. Why these buildings at this scale for this population at this moment? The question is not unanswerable in principle. In some cases, it has been answered convincingly. In others, the answer in the literature is thinner than the question deserves. Some researchers suggest this is simply a gap in the literature, an area where architectural history has prioritized aesthetic and technical analysis over economic and logistical scrutiny. That is a reasonable observation that does not require any unusual interpretation to make. Others suggest the gap is more significant, that the questions raised by the proportionality problem, if pursued seriously, would create pressure on timelines and attribution claims that portions of the academic establishment are not structured to absorb comfortably. Both positions exist in the literature. Neither is uniformly accepted. Neither is uniformly dismissed. There is one more dimension worth introducing before this examination closes. The railway stations built during the period under examination were not the only structures displaying these characteristics. They were accompanied in many of the same cities by post offices, courthouses, municipal water systems, hospital complexes, and educational institutions, all built at scales and to engineering standards that share the same proportionality problem the stations present. If the explanation for the stations is civic pride and industrial ambition, then that explanation must also account for the water treatment facilities, for the underground drainage systems, for the municipal gasworks, for the telegraph infrastructure. These are not glamorous buildings. They do not attract the heritage designation or the tourist attention. They were not built for display. They were built for function, and their scale, in many documented cases, mirrors the excess visible in the stations that stand above them. That consistency, between the visible and the invisible, between the celebrated and the purely functional, is what gives the proportionality observation its most durable form. Pride explains palaces. It does not as cleanly explain sewers built for a population that did not yet exist. The Tartaria framework, whatever its ultimate validity, has directed attention toward a set of observations that the built environment of the 19th century genuinely presents. Whether those observations are best understood as evidence of lost history, as artifacts of a more disruptive past than official timelines acknowledge, or simply as the underexamined consequences of an era whose ambitions exceeded its documentation, that question remains open. The stations are still standing. The platforms are narrower now than the halls that contain them. And the question of who, precisely, was expected to fill them has not received an answer that fully satisfies the scale of what was built to receive them.